Rishi Sunak may have learned a lesson from his new Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, who found when he tried to ask Parliament's consultation before bombing Syria that it didn't go very well. So again, we see the archaic structures of the British so-called constitution in which everything happens by unwritten norm, and the idea that there should be a vote in Parliament before military action is in fact nowhere legally enforceable. Biden is doing the same thing in the United States, not consulting Congress before sending weapons to Israel and now attacking Yemen. Another telling thing, though, as you've just said, is that Keir Starmer has made very clear that his view is that the British Labour Party will support the government. And he said so not on the basis of a single issue determination that he approves, though I'm sure he does, of the idea that capitalist free markets where people can put pressure to change prices are okay until there's a small rise in the price of oil because people are trying to stop a genocide. He hasn't said that. He said that as a blanket policy, he believes that questions of national security and defence should be questions that unite the government and the opposition. And that is a very telling thing, because in the tradition of British Labourism, the tradition from which Keir Starmer comes, there's long been an idea that the Labour Party exists to get a slightly bigger piece of the spoils of empire for the workers of Britain, rather than to, as in the tradition that, say, Jeremy Corbyn represented, rather than to challenge that whole structure of power and domination and empire. And that's why Keir Starmer's bit of the Labour Party was always happy with the monarchy, was always happy with all of the institutions of domination and hierarchy that structure British society. The monarchy may seem like an unnecessary trinket, but when they're bombing Yemen, it becomes clear those institutions are not just a joke, but they propagate violence all over the world.
Now, you mentioned a Labourist tradition. I mean, back post-1945, the Clement Attlee government, Labour government, which is now lauded for creating national health, well, it was also responsible for some dreadful colonial episodes in Malaya and elsewhere, but it was the government which created this link to the United States, whereby Britain dutifully follows, it identifies its own interests as being following wherever the United States goes. And this is another example, I guess?
Absolutely. I mean, the great disappointment for many on the left wing of the Labour Party was that Aneurin Bevan, the closest thing we've ever had in Britain to a Marxist minister, said that the man who created both the National Health Service and our system of council housing managed to do it all at once, which shows when you're really focused and hate the class enemy that you can be quite efficient. But he was the same man who said of Britain's nuclear weapons that he didn't want to go naked into the conference chamber. That is to say that if Britain didn't have nuclear weapons, he would feel as a Labour minister that he wasn't powerful on the world stage. And of course, one should untangle the irony of that statement, because in fact Britain's independent nuclear deterrent can't be used without the say-so of the United States. But that idea that the British working class, through the ideology of universal suffrage, which treats the state as democratic because some small parts of the state are now democratic, that is to say, we can vote for Parliament. We still don't vote for the intelligence services, the military, the judiciary, the civil service. So most of the state remains under the unelected control of Britain's ruling class. But the idea in Labourism that because the British state is now partially democratic, therefore its institutions are our institutions, and therefore its weapons are our weapons, its police are our police. That's been a very dangerous kind of idea, given that those weapons and those police have rarely served the interests of poor people in Britain.
Now, to use an expression, Britain has got form in Yemen and indeed in the Arabian Gulf. I mean, it's been there many times before, hasn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, Yemen has only been a united country since 1990, and South Yemen was first colonised, I think, in 1839 by the British East India Company. That is to say, you can tell a lot about the history of British colonialism by knowing that it took place for many years through a private corporation whose role it was to get profit for its shareholders. British violence has always been entangled with private greed. And so from 1839 to the end of the 1960s, the south of Yemen was ruled as a British colony, while the north of Yemen, at least in the 20th century, had a kind of nominal independence that was in fact structured by the influence of Saudi Arabia, the most important Western-backed state in the region. And so all of Yemen was under the control, direct or proxy, violent nonetheless, of the West and its allies. And so Yemen has been like a kind of Haiti of the Middle East, of West Asia, that is to say, the poorest country in the region, whose people have in many different forms over many different decades, including establishing the only ever nominally Marxist-Leninist state in the Arab world. Over many different forms, the people of Yemen have protested against that poverty and protested against the link between them their poverty, the social question, the class question of their poverty and dispossession, especially peasants who didn't have access to their own land, the link between that fact of poverty and facts of wider regional and global domination, where the feudal landlords who controlled the land of the people of South Yemen were kept in place by the British colonial state. The merchant classes who were more powerful and wealthy in the north of Yemen were kept in place by the support of the Saudi state. So there was a link, just as there was for enslaved people who rose up in Haiti in the world's only ever successful slave revolt, a link between experiences of dispossession and domination and exploitation on a class basis locally and wider imperial dynamics. And that's why the Houthis is a very modern movement, Ansar Allah, that's just referred to by the sort of tribal name of the Houthis in the West, began as a resistance, as an opposition to Saudi domination and to wider Western domination, and they say death to America, and so stand in that complex tradition, which hasn't always been a tradition I would approve of in every respect, a complicated tradition of articulating the connection between opposition to exploitation and wider imperial domination.
No, I mean, so it was reported after Britain took part in the airstrikes last night that Britain had commenced bombing. Actually, Britain has been bombing Yemen for a long time in recent years.
That's right. And one of the striking things that I don't think is remotely surprising, but it tells you everything you need to know about the rules-based international order, is that Britain and America have been very swift to declare that a challenge to commercial shipping, that's not my claim, it's theirs. That is to say, the idea that some ships might not be able to get goods easily through an important waterway is reason enough to bomb and to call people terrorists and fanatics, while the murder of over 20,000 people in a genocide in Gaza is not reason enough for the West to launch one of its vaunted no-fly zones. And indeed, while the famine and brutalization of the people of Yemen, who have suffered in enormous terms in recent years, because in refusing to allow Houthis to take power, as they now have done anyway in Sana'a, the capital city of Yemen, they're still referred to as rebels and terrorists, but in fact, they control the capital. In refusing for years to allow that, the West supported one of the most brutal states in the region, Saudi Arabia, to massacre and demolish the infrastructure of Yemen. And that's been a tragedy that I think the swiftness of Western action to protect commercial shipping lines, combined with their slowness of action to protect Palestinians and their swiftness of action to brutalize people in Yemen, cause famine and devastation in order to protect their regional interests, tells you everything you need to know about the great values of freedom and democracy that we're told the West
stands for. It's also interesting,
for.
every report says that in Yemen itself, among the wider population, there's tremendous support for these attacks on shipping, tremendous support for doing something in support of Palestine.
Well, I mean, you would imagine so. One of the great disgraces of the region, of course, is that, in part because of Western imperial intrigue, Palestinians have been isolated for so long because the monarchy in Jordan and the American-backed dictatorship in Egypt, which controls one of the borders to the Gaza Strip and could therefore allow in aid and support Palestinians, in the pockets of wider imperial power, have failed to do what their own people want them to do, which is stand in solidarity with Palestinians. And it has been a marked point to note that Yemen, the poorest country in the region, with very little capacity, is making a stand and calling not for driving the Israelis into the sea, but calling for humanitarian aid to be let into Gaza as their immediate demand when they carry out these attacks. It's been a very telling point to note that often the poorest people, those with the least capacity, are the most principled in standing up for basic human values of dignity, when those with the power and the wealth fail to do so.
Now, you were studying at Columbia University in New York City. One of the interesting things about what's changed in the United States, and it's been evident around the war in Gaza, is the number of, not just young, but, well, I think mainly young American Jews who are saying, not in my name. I mean, something has shifted there. Can you explain that from your own experience? You know, we're talking about Yemen. I remember a conversation I had just the other day with someone I met through this movement, someone I met on the streets banging a drum on a protest in solidarity with Palestine. And we got talking and he was explaining to me that he's from Yemen. And he was telling me the stories that his grandfather and father had told him about the Jews of Yemen, of how they knew that there was someone in their ancestral village who was known for carving beautiful knives, and this was known as a skill that the Jews possessed in the kind of division of labor in Yemen, and talked in tragic terms of the loss of a cosmopolitan society, which Zionism has played its role in bringing to the wider region, along with other forces in the region that were opposed to cosmopolitan societies too, absolutely. But because the logic of Zionism says that anti-Semitism is an intractable, essential fact that is unalterable in wider society, and so Jews must segregate themselves away.
the Holocaust managed to destroy two Jewish worlds. It destroyed the Jewish world of Eastern Europe, and then aided by the Zionist state, it destroyed the whole Jewish world in the Arab world. And that has been an enormous tragedy. And what the Jewish communities of solidarity and protest coming onto the streets around America and Britain in recent weeks have been saying and doing is we must re-establish those communities of solidarity that recognize that Jews who were maligned and loathed by Western civilization ought to side, not with that same civilization that for thousands of years maligned us, that now claims to be on our side because it finds us to be useful, protected victims. It can say that it's defending us in order to use us as a kind of battering ram to attack others. Western civilization says it defends Jews, and that's why we hate Muslims, because they're threats to Jews. So rather than allowing ourselves to be used as that battering ram for Western civilization, which won't help us and won't help anyone but the profits of a few, these new communities of protest and solidarity say, let's rejoin the old coalitions of the dispossessed, which say, we belong on the streets with Palestinians, and Palestinians are being brutalized by a Western imperial state. We know what it is to be brutalized by a Western imperial state. Even though they put the Star of David on their flag, we know they have nothing in common with our finest traditions. And we want to recreate cosmopolitan worlds of the kind that you find on the streets when Jews march with Muslims and Christians and everyone else.
That's quite interesting. In the autumn, I was in Catalonia. I visited a town, and in the town there was a Jewish ceremonial bath. It had been sealed up in 1492.
Of course, yeah.
Because the Jews were expelled from the new created Kingdom of Spain. And where did they go?
To the Arab world, and to North Africa,
and to the Ottoman Empire.
I was just talking to one of your colleagues about the codifier of rabbinic Judaism. One of our greatest Talmudists, we call him the Ramban, in English called Maimonides, was of course the personal physician to Salahuddin, to Saladin. And today I watch the Israeli state bombing Salahuddin Avenue in Gaza, and it's brutally evocative that just as the Crusaders turned up in Palestine in the name of Western imperial power to brutalize people, so today Zionists do that, and the tragedy is that out of centuries of Jewish persecution, they have persuaded many Jews, for totally understandable reasons, they have persuaded many Jews, bitter and brutalized by centuries of persecution, that our interests lie in constructing a fortress in the wilderness, where we will be safe in a kind of, that's how colonialism sees its settler projects everywhere, where we will be safe through a garrison state. And those of us who come out onto the streets, who are not just anti-Zionists, but pro-Palestinian because we're pro-human freedom, our claim is that there can be no safety through battening down the hatches and establishing a garrison state. There can only be safety through universal freedom.
I mean, it's quite interesting because my experience is that of Israeli society is that because it is, as you say, a garrison state, it's a militarized state, that impacts into Israeli society in ways which, for instance, people don't normally take account of. I mean, domestic violence, things like this. It's a very violent society.
It's got higher rates of private handgun ownership, for example, than most other societies, and that's now expanding into the West Bank, where Smotrich, the far-right Israeli government minister, is helping to hand out guns to Israeli settlers who act with virtual legal immunity and impunity, because if an Israeli is accused of a crime in the West Bank, they go in front of an Israeli civilian court, but if a Palestinian is accused of a crime, they go in front of a military court, which boasts 99% conviction rates. So it's a society constructed around impunity for the settler, justified by the claim that all settler colonial societies have, that the indigenous are terrifying savages that therefore have to be repressed, or they'll burn you out of your homes. Let's not forget the white South Africans, at least their state used to say, if we give freedom to black South Africans, they'll chase us out of our homes and drive us into the sea. So that logic of paranoia sustains the Israeli state, and one of the things that left-wing Jews are engaged in doing is opposing that logic of paranoia and saying, look, you're right as Jews to fear anti-Semitism. Totally. Centuries of European Christian power maligned and brutalized us, and of course there was anti-Semitism too in the Muslim world, and you're right to oppose all of these things, but to read it as the essential property of people who in fact despise you because you've dispossessed them, and to think naively that your friends are those Western imperial states who brutalize all over the world and tell you that they found a use for you, so they're going to defend you now. That's the big mistake.
I mean, I was reading an account by Golda Meir, who became Prime Minister of Israel, of what happened in Jaffa in 1948. And she basically says nothing happened. The Palestinians got up and left because the leaders told them to. And then literally turned the page. I was reading Imam Pape and others describing what had taken place. I mean, the Zionists were using artillery, which they got from the British. They were bombarding the Arab areas, forcing, literally, we talk about forcing people into the sea. The Palestinians were forced into the sea to flee.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, here's the confusing irony. Golda Meir also wrote in her diary in 1948 that she was stunned by the images of of food left on tables when she entered Palestinian villages. Food left on tables, on plates, half eaten, because Palestinians had run away in the middle of their meals. And she looks at those images of food on tables, and these are her words, not mine, and she says, I couldn't help but thinking these must have been the scenes facing Germany German soldiers when they entered Jewish towns and villages across Eastern Europe. So to some extent, even though the scale of violence is often different, to some extent there are basic commonalities of the facts of domination. But the duality of Zionism is that it thinks of itself both as colonial and as anti-colonial. So that is to say, Theodore Herzl wrote to Cecil Rhodes and said, support me, I'm trying to colonize just as you are. But at the same time, settler colonialism always understands itself as the ideology of the victim. So the Pilgrim Fathers who settled America were fleeing religious persecution. The Boers in South Africa were fleeing religious persecution, then were put in concentration camps by the British. So the settler understands themselves as the victim who doesn't have a metropole to go back to. The victim and their victimization justifies their lashing out at others because we have to protect ourselves. And that's how the genuine history of centuries of extreme and degrading Jewish persecution is taken to justify a logic of paranoia at the same time as the settler understands themselves as the representative of the very European society that they also say persecuted.
Now, I was fascinated yesterday watching the South Africans bring their case to the International Court of Justice. They were meticulously going through international law and genocide, what constitutes genocide. And the irony of it was that legislation, that definition of genocide, actually from a Jew, victim of the Holocaust, I mean, he didn't die in the Holocaust, but was drawn up in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War because of what happened under Nazi occupation, the collective reprisals against civilian populations, the use of malnutrition to destroy communities. I mean, that is the irony of it. A state which claims to be a state because it's providing a home for the victims of the Holocaust is in the dock facing charges which were drawn up as a consequence of what the Nazis did in the Second World War.
Yes, I mean, I think the irony is that Israel is involved in these proceedings because it's a signatory to the Genocide Convention. Israel is, of course, not a signatory to, for example, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They're a signatory to the Genocide Convention, one imagines, because it would just be too much a kind of slap in the face to history for the Israeli state to admit that to sign that convention would be to put their own behavior at risk. And so for that, I think, strange historical irony, Israel's involved in this process. I don't think it's particularly surprising that those to whom evil is done do evil in return. So I don't think that we should expect that experiences of suffering are necessarily kind of ennobling, and that if you have suffered, then you're never going to mistreat others. I think, in fact, the historical truth has been, and we see this in all kinds of experiences of oppression. Ask people who know the history of Liberia, where people enslaved and brutalized in America went back, as they saw it, to Africa and ended up constructing an apartheid state in which they persecuted those they found in Africa. It's often the case that people who are abused take on the terms, the language, the norms of abusive power and say, it seems a little bit ambitious to try to create a world free of racism. Let's just create a safe space for us within that racist world and dominate others if need be. And that view, which was a minority view in Judaism, understandably, and in the Jewish world, understandably was given an enormous boost by the fact of the Holocaust, because there were many millions of people, especially across working class Jewish Eastern Europe, who had believed in various different ideas of socialist transformation that promised an egalitarian future where everyone would be free, whether they were social democrats or Marxists or Bundists. And we know what happened to those people. Overwhelmingly, they ended up in gas chambers. And so in the wake of that trauma, it is unsurprising that people reacted by saying, let's double down on our own safety at the cost of others. But we now are decades into that project. We know it hasn't worked. We know it hasn't kept Jews safe. And so I'm asking Jews to take a different course and to inscribe ourselves again in coalitions for universal freedom.
Just the last couple of minutes, just to come back to it. I mean, Keir Starmer refusing the call for a ceasefire in Gaza, now supporting Rishi Sunak in the bombing of Yemen. But Labour's support from Zionism runs very deep, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in 1944 at the Labour Party conference, they passed a motion calling for the transfer of the indigenous inhabitants of Palestine in order to make room for a Zionist state. And people should read the great scholarship of Noam Mashallah, the Palestinian historian, on the concept of transfer in Zionist political thought, which is very important because the abuse of Gaza, the bombardment and genocide of Gaza, is now being depicted through this language of counter-terror, in which it's all about Hamas, because that's the way Western audiences can understand it. But we need to understand the central role that every settler colonial project ultimately comes to a place of saying to the indigenous people, leave or die, and that's what Israel is now doing to people in Gaza. And that idea of transfer has long been central to the support of Israel in its imperial backers. Winston Churchill said, if there's a dog in a manger, that doesn't mean that you should let the dog stay in the manger, you clear it out for the baby. Palestinians were dogs to him. So support for Zionism has long been central in British politics. It's complicated in the Labour Party because it represented itself sometimes as a kind of anti-colonial support for an oppressed group, Jews, who were, from our arrival in Britain, very important important in the Labour Party as members and supporters and voters until recent decades, really. So there's this complicated way that Zionism was sometimes understood as support for the oppressed, but also absolutely as part of the British state's arsenal of colonial allegiances, which, as you said, ensured that Clement Attlee carried out brutality in Malaya, and Harold Wilson was very quiet about brutality in Vietnam. And that history of the Labour Party supporting imperial projects overseas, we ought to see their support for Zionism in part in those terms.
Barnaby Raine, thank you very much for your time and for your insights.